When people think of medieval torture, they tend to imagine fearsome dungeons, terrifying devices, and immediate, brutal violence. However, the reality was often far more mundane, bureaucratic, and, frankly, uninteresting. Torture, when sanctioned by official institutions such as the church or state, was rarely spontaneous. It required a great deal of documentation, discussion, and dull procedural adherence. Rather than a dramatic ordeal, it was frequently characterized by long hours, meticulous record-keeping, uncomfortable seating arrangements, and rust. This story is not about the screams of the accused or the flash of blades. It is about ledgers, wood grain, ink consistency, and the particular angle at which hinges needed to be fastened. It is about the tedium behind the terror. Let us begin. In many regions across Europe, torture could not simply be applied on a whim. It had to be approved. This meant requests, consultations, official seals, and of course, paperwork. Lots and lots of paperwork. When the Church oversaw inquisitorial proceedings, particularly during the late 13th and 14th centuries, a local inquisitor could not unilaterally decide to implement torture. The decision had to go through several layers of clerical review. A letter had to be drafted, handwritten, of course, explaining why torture might be necessary in the given case. This was usually dictated aloud to a scribe, who would write in slow, looping Latin script using iron gall ink and parchment prepared from animal skin. Once written, the letter needed to be sealed with wax, which had to be the correct color and consistency depending on the region and office. Red wax for certain archbishops, green for others, black for a few in the outer reaches of Eastern Europe. After sealing, a courier would carry this document, sometimes hundreds of miles, on horseback, in winter or rain, and often at a walking pace if the roads were poor. If the courier was delayed by weather, bandits, or bureaucratic mishaps, the request could sit unanswered for weeks or even months. Meanwhile, the suspected heretic or criminal would sit in a cell, often reading scripture, carving wood, or simply waiting. Sometimes the request would return with a no. Sometimes the wax would melt en route, and the seal would be considered invalid. In such cases, the entire process had to begin again. Once permission was granted, assuming all clerical stamps were intact, it was time to gather the necessary equipment. Iron procurement. Iron was expensive, and the proper type of iron for constructing torture devices, such as racks, thumbscrews, and stretching ladders, had to be of sufficient strength and purity. Blacksmiths worked slowly, often heating and hammering the metal in small batches. The process required coal, water, and bellows, which had to be manned manually by apprentices. There are recorded instances of inquisitors waiting months for a new crank handle to be forged. Wood selection. Wood was not just chopped and nailed together. Specific types of wood were preferred for different devices. Oak for strength, ash for flexibility, and elm for seats. Before use, wood had to be cured, which could take weeks. Improperly cured wood would warp or splinter, sometimes resulting in embarrassing malfunctions during official procedures. Worse still, many inquisitors complained in writing about creaking noises in the devices, which they felt were distracting. One account from 1342 mentions a rack that squeaked so loudly that the scribe had to stop taking notes until it ended. The position of torturer was not glamorous. It was functional, often unrespected, and rarely well paid. Hiring and training. Contrary to popular belief, one did not simply become a torturer. One was often trained by another, more experienced torturer, in a sort of medieval apprenticeship. This included hours of maintenance instruction, oiling gears, checking ropes for fraying, ensuring pulley systems were aligned at 90-degree angles. There was also training in how to document what occurred during torture. Each session needed to be logged, time started, time ended, methods used, reactions noted, and theological conclusions drawn. The logs were written by hand and sometimes took longer to record than the actual event itself. Compensation and meals. Torturers were usually paid modestly, often in coin, grain, or room and board. In one 1385 record from Burgundy, a torturer was paid in rye bread and a cask of ale once a month. A complaint was filed when the bread was delivered stale. Meals were simple: soups, stews, and stale loaves. Torturers often ate alone. Their uniforms, if provided, consisted of heavy wool garments prone to itching and sweat retention. Perhaps the most boring element of all was not the devices or the personnel, but the paper. Cataloging and filing. The Spanish Inquisition in particular became infamous for its record-keeping. Every accusation, witness testimony, verdict, and authorization for torture was filed. This meant hundreds of rooms across Europe filled with shelves, scrolls, and bound ledgers. The scribes responsible for these documents worked in silence. Pages had to be copied precisely. Ink consistency was constantly tested by making dots on spare parchment and watching how they dried. When a case was closed, it had to be catalogued with proper Latin descriptors. A single misspelling could lead to confusion that delayed future proceedings. In one case, a mistranslation of witchcraft as wine theft led to a decade-long misfiling. Scribes were often nearsighted and used candlelight, which made the process even slower. Poorly lit, slightly damp stone rooms that smelled faintly of mildew and sheep tallow. Ceiling heights and structural concerns. Architectural records from monastic buildings reveal that many chambers had low ceilings, barely 6 or 7 feet high. This was a problem for devices like the strappado, which required overhead suspension. In such cases, holes had to be bored into support beams to raise ceiling hooks, but only if the walls could bear the weight. Masons were sometimes brought in to examine the load-bearing quality of 13th-century walls. Their reports were written in Latin, full of measurements and disclaimers. Ceiling arches came in various styles: Romanesque, Gothic, and transitional. Each had its own impact on echo-acoustics, which torturers and scribes noted when determining which room to use. During winter, torture chambers were cold. There were no fireplaces, and portable braziers were rare. Torturers and scribes wore layered wool clothing and sometimes fingerless gloves while recording details. While many know about the rack and the Iron Maiden, which likely never existed during the actual medieval period, there were countless smaller, less notorious tools, many of them utterly unremarkable. In one unusually detailed record from Florence, a torturer notes that of all his tools, nails are the most time-consuming to acquire. While dramatic cases often make the history books, many medieval trials dragged on for years due to delays, indecision, and procedural confusion. The 1327 Drayton case. A man in Drayton was accused of sorcery. The accuser left town before testifying, and a storm delayed a courier for 2 months. The local bishop's seal had melted in the summer heat, requiring a fresh authorization from the capital. By the time permission arrived, the accused had developed gout and was unable to walk to the chamber. The torturer noted unsatisfactory posture due to swollen foot in his log. Eventually, the trial was dropped due to lack of enthusiasm. 2 different torturers argued over who had the right to use a particular oak chair with iron supports. The dispute escalated to the city council. 3 weeks of debate ensued. In the end, the chair was deemed common property, but by then, the original suspect had died of old age. In 1398, the key to the main chamber in Avignon was lost. A locksmith had to be summoned from Marseilles. Unfortunately, he was busy with cathedral maintenance and took 4 months to arrive. The interim period was spent polishing other tools, translating transcripts into Latin, and resorting index cards. The romanticized notion of medieval torture masks a far duller reality. It was not a world of constant screaming and dramatic punishment. Rather, it was a domain of crumbling paperwork, rusted hinges, misaligned ropes, and endless waiting for authorization. Torturers were more like mechanics and bureaucrats than monsters, tethered to their ledgers, hunched over in cold rooms, complaining about candle smoke and drafty windows. Their tools broke. Their meals were bland. Their scripts were long and riddled with errors. And so it went, day after day. Nothing much happened. And it often sucked.